Good morning. I'm Tara Rodriguez. I'm the Director of the Division of School Program Improvement here at the Kentucky Department of Education, and I'm so glad you're able to join on the webinar this morning. I've got a lot of information to share with you, and I hope that it will be beneficial to your Title I program. So let's start with a few logistics of the webinar this morning. If you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to email those to me. I'm going to answer those either at the next webinar, or if it's very specific to your particular district, you'll receive an email response to your question. And of course, if I answer next month at next month's webinar, we'll make sure to not include the district name or your name. But if it's something that could benefit others from hearing the question and the answer, we would want to include that. This webinar will be recorded and it'll be posted on the Title I Documents and Resources webpage. Usually that happens within a day or two of the conclusion of the webinar. So let's take a look at the agenda for this morning. First, we're going to start with a review of the January webinar topics, just a quick review. We'll have an update on the regional Title I meetings. Got a couple slides on that. Then we're going to spend some more time, as requested, talking about the allowability process. This is what I mentioned during the Title I regional meetings, if you've been able to attend one of those. And in response to requests at the Title I regional meetings, I'll be spending some time talking about aligning munis and GMAP. During our January webinar, if you recall, we talked about the Census and School District Boundary Review Program, or SDRP, and we went into some detail going over the notification of tentative census, poverty, and hold harmless percentages. If you missed that webinar and would like to go back and look at that information, it is linked on our Title I Documents and Resources webpage. The agenda for today is going to, we already went over the agenda, sorry about that. So let's talk then about, we're going to start talking about allowability procedures. And we're going to start just by giving a little bit of context and looking at statute, regulation, policy, and procedures, and what the differences are between those. Statute is a law or an act enacted by a legislature. And we're all familiar with Title I statute, which is the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. And then we also have our state statutes, which are the KRS, or Kentucky Revised Statute. We also have regulations. Regulations interpret the requirements of an office or agency. For example, in Kentucky, we have the KAR, which is the Kentucky Administrative Regulations. And then we also follow the Code of Federal Regulations for federal grants, which is the CFR. And we're going to see some information about the CFR later on. Regulations are created by an office or agency under the authority granted by the legislature, and it has the full force and effect of law. So let's talk a little bit more about regulations. Current regulations for Title I are located in Part 200 of the Code of Federal Regulations. Why is this important? And that's because regulations have the force and effect of law, as I stated. The Federal Department of Education is updating the Code of Federal Regulations to reflect changes in the ESEA as amended by ESSA. So, for example, one update they made was to take out or to amend the language around adequate yearly progress to make sure that it will align with ESSA language. Then we have guidance documents also, and guidance documents help define standards or expectations that are part of a rule or regulation. Guidance documents may help interpret existing law and provide current agency thinking on an issue. And we use a lot of non-regulatory guidance in our division. For example, you may be familiar with the McKinney-Vento Homeless Non-Regulatory Guidance and the Equitable Services Non-Regulatory Guidance, and we provide links to that on our webpage whenever we can, because that is very helpful for districts to get some guidance on those topics. So now let's move on to policy. Policy is intended to accomplish certain goals, so it's oriented around goals, and it differs from laws in the way it's enforced and the consequences of non-compliance. Procedures are steps to achieve goals. So it's very important that districts have some written procedures, and in fact, there are some requirements that districts and state agencies maintain written procedures on some different topics. And we're going to talk about one of those today because I referenced it during the presentation during the regional meeting, and as one of the specifically allowability procedures. And that was one of the top 10 ways that districts can help to ensure that their application is approved quickly or as quickly as possible, because if you can, and basically allowability processes lays out the process that you're going to use to ensure that costs are allowable that you put in your Title I application. And so if you have a process that helps you on the front end, maybe weed out or disallow certain things before they get into the Title I application, that could potentially save you some time in getting your application approved. So let's talk about what is required for written procedures. Written procedures should outline manageable steps, okay? Everyone must know and follow them. If it's just on a paper but nobody actually does it, then it's not really it's not really meeting requirements, and it's not very useful. Procedures don't have to be overly complicated, and in fact they shouldn't be. They need to be doable so that everybody understands and can follow those. For one example, if you have a certain process or procedure that requires a supervisor's signature, but that supervisor is not available when the form needs to be provided or signed, that might be something that you would need to take a look at, because we need to make sure that the process is written so that the supervisor would be available to sign off on that if it's part of the part of the process. So specifically now talking about allowability procedures, this is a required written procedure that must address how you are ensuring that costs on the federal grant are allowed under the individual federal program, which in this case is Title I, and in accordance with the cost principles established in the Uniform Grant Guidance. Now, the Uniform Grant Guidance contains the Code of Federal Regulations, and when we talk about, quote, Code of Federal Regulations, and I'm going to share 3 specific ones with you a little bit later, we are talking about the ones that are in education, which fall under the Uniform Grant Guidance. And as I said a minute ago, these regulations detail requirements across grants. So it's not, the Uniform Grant Guidance has requirements across different grants. So written allowability procedures are required under CFR 200-302. There's the citation for it. And there are several factors that affect the allowability of costs. All right, all costs must be necessary, reasonable, and allocable, and adequately documented. They have to conform with federal law and grant terms. They must be consistent with state and local policies, and they have to be consistently treated. So costs can't be assigned to a federal award as a direct cost if any other cost incurred for the same purposes in like circumstances has been allocated as an indirect cost. Costs have to be in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles and not included as a cost or used to meet cost sharing or matching requirements of any other federally financed program. So if you go to that citation there at the top, or in that second bullet, you will see these listed out in the CFR. So I'm going to talk to you in just a minute about our allowability process here at KDE, so that you can get an idea of just an idea that you might want to look at as well when you're writing yours, if you still need some work on that. Before we do, I wanted to share, when I keep referring to these Code of Federal Regulations and the education section and the ones that apply to federal education grants. So I wanted to just briefly say that we use this book a lot because it pulls together all the Education Code of Federal Regulations. The book is updated every year. Unfortunately, it's not a free book, and it is not something that the federal government puts out, but it is very helpful and we use it a lot. So I just wanted to let you know about that in case that's something that might be of help to you as well. So let's talk a little bit then about the allowability process that KDE has in place, in case that you might want to use some of this for yours, although it wouldn't probably look exactly like ours. One of the factors that we use in our allowability process, we look at whether it's reasonable, allocable, necessary, and documented, which was on a couple of slides ago, one of the requirements of allowable costs. So is the cost reasonable? And that means it can't be excessive in cost, and it's got to be based on prudent and sound purchasing practices. So in the KDE allowability process, we have put some guiding questions under each section that would help us determine whether a cost would be allowable. For example, does the cost of the expense seem reasonable in comparison to other comparable examples I've encountered? What examples could I provide to any auditor to document the cost as reasonable? And as I've shared during our regional meetings, this allowability process would be something that you would want to share with, say, principals of schools and other district staff who might also need to know this information. In addition to whether the cost is reasonable, we also need to be sure that it is necessary, that if this is something that's essential for carrying out the needs-based Title I Part A program. And here's some other guiding questions that you might want to use, or there could be others as well. Could the cost be deemed necessary for the operation of a quality, efficient Title I Part A program? Is it supported? This is an important one because we really have to go back to the needs assessment, the school improvement plan, the district improvement plan, other documentation that might be in the GMAP application or some other needs assessment format. We really have to make sure that we have justification for this to show that it's necessary. And then what examples could be provided to document that this is a necessary cost? Next, we have to make sure that it's allocable. The cost is, and that means that the cost is incurred specifically for the benefit of the program. It's distributed proportionately, it's an allowable activity, and meets the program's intent. And here you see quite a number of guiding questions, and I won't read all those to you because you'll be able to access these later. But basically, we're looking at what the current guidance, statute, regulation, etc. says about allowability. We're also looking at the proportionality. If this cost and another program pays for another part of the cost, is the benefit that each program receiving proportionate to the cost? There are some other categories here. For another one, for example, is the funding matrix that KDE has on one of our budget pages. If the cost is in that funding matrix, or if it's not in there, perhaps it's because it's not allowable. And again, what examples could be provided to an auditor to determine and document that this cost is allocable? And last, we want to show that the cost is documented. Could it be documented through allowability procedures, the needs assessment, the school or district plan, standard purchasing processes, or district policy? And as I stated, your allowability procedures should include those same categories as well, but it might differ somewhat in other aspects from what we have, because you might want to put in your process some approval levels. For example, here at KDE, our consultants would follow this process and determine whether a cost was allowable or not. For a district allowability process, you might want to specify who's going to approve these costs, who's going to make the determination, or who's going to sign off on allowable costs. You might want to also, like we did, include some questions to ask when determining allowability. You might want to reference the state and your local or district rules and policies. And you might also want to think about including your district's travel policy in there as well. So, if you have any questions on these allowability processes, please, again, feel free to send me an email, and I will follow up with you after this webinar or at next month's webinar. So, the next item on the agenda was an update on the Title I regional meetings. We have held 3 meetings so far. We have 3 more to go. We have 1 tomorrow and then 2 next week. The March newsletter, as I've mentioned during a number of these Title I regional meetings, the March newsletter will be filled with questions and answers that have come up during the regional meetings. That seemed like a good way to get those questions out there answered so that everybody can see them. And I also want to say that how much I've enjoyed meeting those people who have been able to attend, and I hope that the information provided has been beneficial to you. One other thing that I wanted to share, because this will be at the regional meetings tomorrow and next week, but you see that there's a deadline on this slide, so I just wanted to get that out there to you now. The federal government has put out some draft information on supplement, not supplant. Many states have been asking for that, some guidance on that area, and I know districts have been asking for that as well. So this is a draft informational document that has been put out for public comment. It just came out in mid to late January. This is a live link, so when this presentation is posted, you'll be able to go and click that link and go and review that guidance. There's a lot of information about requirements, there are a lot of examples, and there are some frequently asked questions. Keep in mind that it is draft. There will be the time for public comments ends on February 28th, and there will likely be several months where the federal government has to respond to the comments and questions. And then at some point they will finalize it. They'll make any revisions necessary and will finalize it. So there is definitely the potential for change in some of that information, but if you would like to see what has been put out there, that again, that's a live link. You can also submit questions to the email address that's provided there. And again, the deadline to do that is February the 28th. Next, I wanted to talk to you about the importance of aligning GMAP and munis. And this section is in response to several questions that came up during our regional meetings. And I'm going to apologize in advance because I'm going to have to refer to my notes quite a bit during this section because it was such a quick turnaround time that I wanted to bring you timely and quick information as promised, but you know, I'm just going to have to refer to my notes, so please bear with me on this. So just to give some background and context, as you know, districts must have an approved application in GMAP before they can spend funds, and that application hopefully very specifically and with a lot of detail outlines the activities that are going to be undertaken as part of the grant, and also the costs that the district believes are going to be needed to carry out the activities in that plan. And the consultants here at KDE will review the application and will determine whether the activities and the costs are allowable and whether they meet the intent and purpose of Title I, and then they will make a decision or a determination about whether that application will be approved or whether some revision is going to be needed on it. During the course of the school year, as districts start to spend the funds on that application, on that approved application, sometimes the spending in munis may end up that it doesn't quite match what was originally put in the approved application. So we're asking that districts periodically go in and amend their GMAP application to make it match the munis expenditures. This is not a new requirement, and the timeline for this alignment is going to depend on the district. We're asking the districts have a process by which or a timeline and by which they would go in and do this. And we're not saying how often that has to occur. It really depends on the district. But it is important that the GMAP application and munis are aligned for several reasons. We're going to take a look at some simple GMAP examples in munis that I'm going to use to illustrate some of what I'm talking about. I know that when the more schools there are in the district, the more complicated this process gets. However, the expectation that GMAP and munis are aligned remains the same, and I'll explain the reasons for that as we go along. So let's take a look at one of those examples. We're going to show an example of a district munis. The district name and identifying information has been erased from this. But in this slide, you can see that the district has budgeted $37,423 in Code 110 and munis for a certified salary for a school-level position. In this particular district's GMAP application, they budgeted $37,057 in Code 110 for the salary. Although they budgeted slightly less in GMAP than in munis, we can see on the munis report that they have $20,364 still available. We also see that they've spent around $17,059 total so far in this code. We are not asking that this district would need to go into GMAP and change the budgeted amount to match the $17,059 that has been spent in munis. When we're talking about alignment, we're not saying that the amount spent so far in munis has to match the amount in GMAP. This district would be okay on this code because the amount they've budgeted in GMAP is pretty close to what they budgeted in munis, and they still have funds available. If there aren't any changes with this position throughout the year, more than likely the district would not need to make adjustments in GMAP in this particular code if they've budgeted enough funds to pay for this salary. Districts need to self-monitor to make sure that if there are any differences in the budget, that they are meeting parent and family engagement obligations, meeting neglected and delinquent requirements if they have any facilities that they're serving, and that they're maintaining rank order. Districts that hire a larger number of positions with Title I funds might see some changes in their positions throughout the year. In that case, the FTE, headcount, descriptions, and budget would need to be revised in GMAP, and that application would need to go through the approval process again when changes in personnel and positions occur. So here on this slide, we can see some of those applicable federal regulations. 34 CFR 76 talks about compliance with statutes, regulations, the state plan, and applications. And it specifically says that, well, it says that basically districts must comply with the state plan, regulations, statutes, and approved applications, and must use federal funds in accordance. So that is a requirement that has not changed. You must spend according to your approved GMAP application, and that's why GMAP needs to go back in and be justified periodically, whether it's the budget or if activities have changed substantially from time to time. Another CFR is 76.707, and that one talks about when obligations are made. If you have seen your federal award, then you will notice there's a deadline on there when funds need to be spent or when they need to be obligated, and or when they are spent and when they are obligated. This particular regulation will actually lay out some different cases. For example, when personnel are hired or when travel is taken, when are those funds actually obligated? We will probably have a little bit more information on this one in next month's webinar. Another Code of Federal Regulations that is very applicable in aligning munis and GMAP is 76.708, and that one talks about when districts may begin to spend or obligate funds. This is July 1st for each fiscal year, or the date the application is approved, whichever is later. And this just goes back to support that you must have an approved application to begin spending funds. So let's move on a little bit. And again, these Code of Federal Regulations are in the book that I mentioned to you before. So go back, if we look at this screen, let's take another look at another munis code from a district report. And we're going to look this time at Registration Fees Code 338, and you can see that we have a red circle around a budgeted, one of the amounts there. And we can see that the district has spent over $3,000 but hasn't budgeted any funds for the code. And let me just go back just a second. The district did put some short descriptors of what this expense was for, but I took those out just for the purposes of this presentation. But again, we can see that the district has spent over $3,000 but hasn't budgeted any funds for the code. These activities and expenditures are not in this district's GMAP application. So this district would be required to go into GMAP and budget the funds in this code and provide a narrative about the activities in GMAP. In this case, the activities the district had listed, which I erased, but the activities were probably allowable. However, if this district was monitored and it was found that they had spent the funds on unallowable activities, KDE would require them to pay the $3,000 back to the grant and use their general funds instead. This is one important reason why GMAP needs to match munis. We never want districts to have to be in a payback situation. Requiring districts to periodically align GMAP with munis is one way that we can help districts avoid payback situations. Another issue a district could run into if they are overspent in munis in some district set-aside categories, and if they don't go in and justify with GMAP. Over time, the district may not realize the implications of the overspending. Even if the budget total at the end of the munis report shows there are funds available, some potential problems could be hidden. If the district overspends in district set-asides, that money has to come from somewhere. So schools might not receive the full amount which they were allocated, which could also affect rank and serve. Overspending in district set-asides could also result in the district not having enough funds for parent and family engagement, which is a requirement for districts that receive over $500,000 in Title I funds. Periodically amending GMAP to reflect the expenditures in munis could help draw attention to any potential problems that would affect the school's allocations or required expenditures such as parent and family engagement. During the Title I regional meetings, a few districts have asked if munis could substitute for the budget in GMAP. There are some issues with this. First of all, not all districts set up their munis accounts in the same way. This could make it difficult for KDE staff to ensure that budgets in munis align with the GMAP application. GMAP also does a number of calculations, such as calculations for equitable services and parent and family engagement. Keeping these budgeted amounts together with the activities being carried out in each of the categories maintains a clear connection between the grant activities and the funds, which makes it easier to trace where the funds are going and how they're being used. KDE staff will continue to look for ways that the application and budget process can be streamlined while still ensuring that we can ensure and maintain proper oversight of the grant. So we ask that you continue to go in and align GMAP and munis according to your district process. The GMAP budget provides us with additional details that may not be captured in munis and that may not be captured in other parts of the application. For example, the school descriptions provide information about needs across the school which may encompass more than Title I funds. So I just want to summarize this by saying that these requirements are for districts' protection. It's to make sure that districts are spending funds according to the approved application, which is a requirement under 34 CFR 76.700. We also want to make sure that districts are able to fulfill obligations toward rank and serve in activities like parent and family engagement if they're required. KDE must maintain proper oversight of the grant, and we believe that keeping GMAP and munis aligned is an important part of that oversight. During monitoring, we check for alignment between GMAP and munis. If they're not aligned, the district will be required to align or justify them. The district may be asked to provide a process to KDE that shows the process for keeping them aligned periodically, if that is a finding. And so, just to reiterate, it is a requirement that this occurs. I hope this has been helpful in explaining the reasons why aligning GMAP and munis is important. If you have any additional questions about this, please feel free to email me and we will make sure to get answers to your questions. And so let's see, there are a few resources that I used in constructing this webinar PowerPoint. And then also my contact information. And let me say one more time, I'm very thankful and glad that you were able to join this morning, and hope that we will be able to talk soon, either face-to-face or through email. Thank you for joining.